Today we're going to learn about the circular flow diagram. This is a model that economists have developed as a way of representing the interrelationships between organizations in the economy. And we've already started doing a little bit of thinking about these interrelationships. And we've thought about the way in which organizations interact in various markets. That was what we studied in microeconomics. But if you remember, we were talking about specific markets, like markets for an iPhone or markets for mate tea. The housing market, for example, we discussed in our last Socratic. In contrast, here we're looking at a variety of markets put together. And we're going to think about this model of the way these organizations first interact in a very simplified way. And we're only going to think about the interaction between households and also firms or businesses. And the first way in which households and firms interact is in what are called the input or factor markets. And the assumption here is that households are supplying factors of production that firms are demanding. Now, this is different than the way we've described the interaction between households and firms so far. We've been assuming that firms are supplying the products, but before firms can produce the products, they need factors of production. That's where households come in. So if you think about it, as households, we supply labor to firms. Probably many of you have family members who work for businesses. All right, we are supplying our labor. We're providing this factor of production of labor. Households are also supplying capital or capital goods. Remember, capital goods are the manufactured goods we need to make and produce other finished products and services. And households supply capital, you could argue, because we deposit our money into bank accounts. And banks turn around and they loan those deposits out to businesses as well as households. But when they loan it out to businesses, all right, those businesses are taking those loans and they're using them to purchase capital goods. For example, if you started a pizzeria, you would need an oven. You'd need a physical location and space to produce the pizza and provide the pizza to your customers. All of those things would be capital goods. Now, the final way in which households supply a factor of production is they supply land or resources. This is kind of an abstract idea. The idea is that initially, when we first sort of started developing as a society, households owned all of the land, and over time, right, they have supplied it to businesses. Another way to think about it is, probably many of us own a home or our families own a home, and that is land that maybe potentially at some point we could supply to a firm. Now, in exchange for providing these factors of production to firms, right, provide a payment to households. This is probably most straightforward when you think about how, as I mentioned, a lot of family members probably work for businesses. They supply their labor, and in exchange, they get paid. They make a salary or an income, okay, from that labor they are providing. Now, if you think about it, what firms do is they take all of those factors of production, many of which they're getting from households, they put them all together to produce a finished good or service. And in the output or product markets is where households and firms interact and where firms provide these finished goods and services. Okay, they supply these finished goods or services to households. Households then come together and they interact in markets with firms and they purchase these goods and services, providing payment to firms. Now notice, again, obviously this is a simplified version of the interactions that go on in the economy, but it does capture a very important reality of the fact that households and firms their fates are intertwined, they're interrelated, right? If households are doing well, okay, and they're getting a lot of payments, that means they have more money to purchase goods and services, and the same is true of firms as well. Now, if we zoom out and we now think about how we need to incorporate other organizations, okay, probably you realize that we need to make sure we include government as an organization in our model we're building. And we also need to include the fact that countries interact with each other. We have international trade, so we're going to include what we're calling the rest of the world as well as government to build our circular flow model. Now, the first thing to realize is what we've already talked about, that firms, okay, provide wages, interest, dividend, profits, and rents. These are payments that firms make to household in exchange for those factors of production and what were called input markets. Households, as we've talked about, purchase finished goods and services from firms. Now, both households and firms interact with the government, which we've tried to think about in developing this circular flow diagram. So households, they pay taxes to the government, okay? And in exchange, the government provides services to households. Now, none of us like to pay taxes, but government does provide a lot of important services to households that we couldn't provide on our own. And so, for example, probably many of you are hoping to qualify for a scholarship, okay? Hopefully many of you are hoping to qualify for some sort of program that will help you pay for the cost of college. This is what's called a transfer payment. A transfer payment is when the government makes a payment to you as a household, but not in exchange for a finished good or service. In terms of these other ones, wages, remember, a lot of households work for the government. A lot of individuals work for the government, so they get paid wages for their work. Also, a lot of individuals households own bonds. They give loans in effect to the government, so the government needs to pay them interest for those loans. Firms also, theoretically, pay taxes to the government, and the government oftentimes purchases goods and services from firms. For example, if the government wants to build a road, they're going to put out a contract for companies that are going to basically offer a bid, the price that the government would have to pay them to pave that road, and in that way, the government is purchasing finished goods and services from firms. Now, if you think about it, what we've really described, we haven't said this explicitly, but what we've really described is this is the interaction of a single country's economy. This is household and government and firms interacting. But remember, it's not just one country that interacts entirely with itself, right? Countries interact with each other, and that's why households, okay, purchase foreign-made goods and services, right? We import goods and services. We've talked about this a bunch, but for example, probably many of us have goods and services with us, or really goods that were made in other parts of the world. And also, we export, our firms sell products to other parts of the world. So this circular flow diagram is really helpful in thinking about these interrelationships that categorize the whole economy. And it gives us insight into the ideas we talked about with the more simplified model before, that really we're intertwined, we're interrelated. So that generally speaking, if one organization is doing well, okay, probably the entire economy is growing and flourishing. And we'll talk more about that when we start talking about recessions and how we can use this model to understand some of the dynamics of recessions, and then also some of the dynamics that might help us get out of recessions. So the circular flow diagram, it represents an important transition in this class if you think about it. Because up to this point, we've been studying individual markets. Before we talked about this diagram, we were studying microeconomics, right? Which, as we talked about, is about individual markets, right? Microeconomics is about the decision-making and behavior of individual firms and households. So what my individual family decides to do, okay, what Apple or some specific other individual company decides to do. we were also focused on how markets work, but specific markets work in the production of particular products in individual industries. Again, right, what's happening in for Samsung in the Android market? What's happening for what's happening in the industry for hip hop? Okay, so specific markets. In contrast, and if you think about it, our chart that we just looked at, the circular flow diagram, really marked this transition to macroeconomics. We're not just focused on an individual market. Okay, we are focused on the broader whole, and specifically we're focused on things like total national output. So adding up the value of all things that are produced in the economy, okay, how the entire economy fits together, how all those organizations are interdependent and are connected as we just talked about. We're also interested in looking at measurements like national income. On average, how much people are making in the country. What's happening overall throughout the entire economy to price level? What's happening overall to employment? And we focus on what's called aggregate behavior. Now this term aggregate, all it means is just adding up. So we're focused on adding up all the behavior in the economy, okay, the behavior of all households and firms, to understand overall what's happening to the overall economy. Now this is a really, really important distinction, because in this class moving forward, we're only going to be studying we're only going to be really focusing on macroeconomics. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is in about a sentence or two, I want you to clearly explain the difference between micro and macroeconomics in your own words. So one way to think about this is, I've seen some good analogies that have been used to explain this difference. That micro, for example, is about the trees, and macro is about the forests. So you could start with an interesting analogy here, but then what you need to make sure you do is you need to make sure you explain how that analogy makes sense and how it shows that difference between micro and macro. So I'm going to ask you to press pause right now in this recording, take 3 or 4 minutes, and in that embedded form, answer this question. Okay? Okay, so the difference between micro and macro. You know, the real difference between micro and macro is that micro is focused on specific individual markets and households. So we're interested in a very specific small slice of the economy, like the housing market, like the low skills jobs market if we're focused on minimum wage. In contrast, macroeconomics is about the entire economy. So it's interested in what's happening overall. Is the economy growing or shrinking? What's happening to jobs? What's happening to overall income? So we're focused on that bigger picture. This concludes the lesson on circular flow.